So thank you all for joining us. It's been great to talk to many of you this morning and see the excitement around this topic. So thank you so much for coming and spending this time with us. This is the Duke University's office in Washington, D.C. And this event is hosted by the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, which is just called the Nicholas Institute, and the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, EPIC. So we're co-hosting this event this morning today. And we are here for a session on financing nature-based solutions using green banks, and I'll say and other similar financial institutions. So we don't want to be exclusive, but it was a kind of a punch your name to just say green bank. So I want to just quickly tell you a little story about why I wanted to put this event together. So I have a good friend and colleague in North Carolina who decided to start North Carolina's Green Bank, which is really getting going. And she comes from the energy side of things. And I said, could we do nature-based stuff too? Could we do that? She's like, I don't know, what would that look like? And I said, I have some vague ideas, but I don't really know. So this conversation is in response to that. I wanted to get people together to figure out how we could do this and how we could do it at scale and how we could get innovation going in this space. And as you all know, there's a lot going on nature-based solutions right now. So the White House had a national roadmap report that came out in November of last year on nature-based solutions. There's also a lot happening on green banks right now with the greenhouse gas reduction fund coming out of EPA with billions of dollars. So how can we marry those two? That's the topic for today. So I just want to note that this session is part of a larger effort we're trying to put together, and we're hoping to create a workbook or a guidebook for green banks on nature-based solutions, and also trying to think of other things we can do to address barriers and enhance kind of learning about this across green banks and similar financial institutions. So if you have ideas about that, we'd love to hear them. I want to note that this session is going to be recorded, or is being recorded. We are going to be sharing this out with people who are able to come in person today, and maybe with some other green banks who might be interested in learning more. All right, so with that, I think that's everything I need to mention off the top. So I'm going to introduce our moderator. So Phoebe Higgins from EPIC is moderating our session this morning. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. Good morning, everybody. Super excited to be here and see everyone here. I am moderating this session, but first you're going to hear from our panelists. And those, yep, you can see who everybody is here. First, we'll start with Andy Holness, who is the Deputy Director and Climate Fellow at New England Forestry Foundation, and formerly the Director for Global Green Bank Development at the Coalition for Green Capital. Then we'll go to Matthew Carney, who is Associate Director at Quantified Venture, and then Luke and Jacob from who's an Environmental Protection Specialist at the DC Department of Energy and Environment. They'll each speak for about 15 minutes on their perspectives of financing nature-based solutions and offer case studies, examples and such. And then we'll have time for a few questions after they each speak. So you can ask them direct questions about what they've presented. And then we'll have time at the end too for more Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andy.
Literally.
Oh.
Thanks, Phoebe. I'm just so excited that Duke has convened this conversation, because exactly that question comes up all the time. How are we going to scale nature-based solutions? What's the role of finance, green banks? We're all thinking, swirling, talking, and so I'm very much looking forward to the conversation over the next few days. Thank you for doing that. And Sarah, who made it up, actually. And I'm interested about who's in the room. I understand we have some students, some NGOs, some climate finance folks, some attorneys in the space. So it's a great diverse audience with, I think, good perspectives that will be really interested in going out. So I'm going to start by pushing that. Oh yeah, there we go. So that's my slide right here. So why bother? Why does this matter? There are two reasons why nature-based solutions and green banks are super important to consider. The first is, which I'll spend the first few slides on, is just to ground the conversation for the day. nature-based solutions really matter. There is no country in the world, I think, who doesn't also include carbon dioxide removal in their NDCs, in their plan to achieve the Paris Agreement. They have become absolutely essential to getting to where we need to go. And they are not on the agenda as a point of action generally in the space. We're focused on renewables, but we haven't yet figured out how to do carbon dioxide removal. The second reason why it really matters to have this conversation is green banks, and I have one slide in here on green banks just to make sure we're all on the same page. Green banks are supposed to be two things at least: market fit, so market specific to needs, and they're supposed to be on the cutting edge, taking the risk that lies between investment and what were the investors and the investments that are essential. So what the greenhouse gas reduction fund is going to be focused on will be in that space, but on stuff which it seems like we're already getting reasonably comfortable with, the stuff that we are very uncomfortable with, where risk is perceived as a major barrier, is absolutely essential for our catalytic climate finance capacity to address if we're going to be opening markets and increasing investment in capacity. So there are two really, really big reasons why this matters. And I used to work with the Coalition for Green Capital, where I led our global efforts to create green banks around the world in the developing world and managed the Green Bank Network, which was existing green banks. And we created the first green banks in the developing world in Southern Africa, Rwanda, Uganda, some other places. But I'm now working with the New England Forestry Foundation on putting it on the ground in terms of nature-based solutions in our region with national impact. And just by context, at CGC, at New England Forestry Foundation, we're one of the recipients of the new Climate Smart Commodities Program. So we have a $30 million grant to pilot climate smart forestry and attach it to greenhouse gas outcomes along with bio-based economy. 30 million is a lot, but it's a drop in the bucket against scaling the opportunity. So as we work on our pilot to define climate smart forestry and how it can work on the ground, developing the financing mechanisms to take it to scale is absolutely parallel to that. So that's how our current work connects. So why bother? Well, in the US right now, private forests are currently sequestering 84% of the carbon that's being sequestered by forests. That's a bit counterintuitive, right? Because we think public lands are so big, but our public lands are what? Burning. So it's our private lands that have huge carbon sequestration and storage potential. And the IPCC is well on record to the importance of nature-based solutions and the role of forests in that. So I'm going to just give our local example, and then I'm going to come back up to the national perspective. In New England, analysis that New England Forestry Foundation has done has shown that if we manage our forests better, climate smart forestry, we could actually deliver 30% of what is needed to meet our 2050 targets. That's huge. And there are similar, although different stories in different regions of the country because it depends on forest type and condition, et cetera. This is the backstory. This is just context about how nature-based solutions can have an impact in one area. This light green area, which is largely in 10 million acres of industrial ownership, commercial ownerships. These are smaller, non-commercial private ownerships. The light green shows very light stocking, something like 15 cords an acre, where old growth is something like 45 cords an acre. And the level that we're aiming for is somewhere in between that, around 25 cords an acre. If we increase stocking here by incentivizing, paying these owners to do climate smart forestry, that's where we could sequester 30% of the emissions reductions needed for New England. And then there's a different kind of strategy to do on these lands, which are heavily stocked, and it's more about continuing harvest to provide wood products and to address leakage that might occur by restricting harvest on other lands. The idea, I think the myth that a lot of us struggle with convincing people about nature-based solutions, certainly in the forest space, is that really what it means is locking forests up and never harvesting trees. That's the way we sequester the carbon, right? That's actually a myth. It doesn't really work that way in human society because there are, what, 8 billion of us right now? And we have to build our buildings and insulate them and build our infrastructure. So the idea is, how do we pay landowners to sequester carbon on the ground while generating product for the bioeconomy? Because nationally, we have to make this shift from a carbon economy to a bioeconomy. Some of that is renewables. Some of it is shifting to electric vehicles that are sourced by those renewables. But then we build an enormous amount of infrastructure. I think there's something like a new New York City equivalent level of infrastructure that's built globally every 30 days. So fueling this shift is a key part of the way that forests relate to nature-based solutions. So that's just the backstory. And this is relevant across the country if you look at the major forested regions across the US. And the story and how it relates to practices varies across each of these regions. But if we are going to be developing nature-based solutions as they relate to forests and forest harvesting and forest products, this is the constituency that we have to tie together to make a case with funding sources, be they large public sources or corporate sources that are investing in carbon reduction. So that's another reason why I'm incredibly excited about this kind of gathering, because we have to connect our thinking and our strategies and our thoughts. So I think my role here was to present a case study, but of course, because nature-based solutions are largely unwritten, I'm not going to be able to present a case study. I'm going to present a fund structure that we're excited about, continued development of the concept, and then working with folks both regionally and nationally to try and get this funded, ideally through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, but that is unlikely to happen, I'm sure. So in some way or another. So I just pulled this out of my old CGC materials and changed the logo, whatever, to provide some kind of basis for what we're talking about. And I think everyone in this room is well aware, so I won't spend much time on it. But we should remember the role of green banks in our space. A capital mobilizer, capital provider, a lead arranger, an innovator, a capacity builder in the space, and feedback on the enabling environment. This stuff is super important around nature-based solutions because we don't really know yet what we're doing. And an institution that is designed to go into that space, define it, enable it, support the flow of capital, take risk, fail so we can succeed at a larger level. It's an essential structure for the challenge that we face in this space. And then, of course, the Green Bank brings public capital that can absorb risk to crowd in private investment. And we're, that's the role and the challenge. So now I'm going to apply it to the concept. And I just have 2 slides on the concept. So we're interested in creating what we're calling a forest climate investment fund. The goal, as I've been trying to frame for you, would be to store more carbon in the forest by changing the forest practices. So we sequester and store more in-forest carbon, and then also through that generate valuable wood product that we can harvest to continue to store much, not all of that carbon, in the harvested wood products, and use those wood products to substitute for steel and concrete and other carbon. So if you look at that kind of big picture, there's at least 2 buckets of financing activity that's needed. One is on what is happening in the forest, right? How do we incentivize those landowners to invest in climate smart forestry, which takes a fair amount of time to amortize and deliver result that then can be paid back over a much longer tenor than finance institutions typically work with. And then the other arena, which I'm not going to talk about today, is what's happening on the building side, right? What are the barriers that are in the market that could be addressed to facilitate working with mass timber and other innovative wood technologies in various sectors. At NEF, we're right now focused on affordable housing and mass timber through our Climate Smart Commodities grant. But of course, that's a bigger space, and understanding the financial barriers there to reduce the perception of risk and advance wood construction to lower embodied carbon is a major area of interest as well. The goals being to provide low cost, affordable financing to landowners. That has both the ability to work in a financial model to be paid back based on the value of the timber, and a tenor that is consistent with doing climate smart forest management. Obviously a blended approach where we're blending risk tolerant capital with regular investment capital and understanding how that can work. And all focused around maintaining and increasing timber yield while also serving biodiversity and climate objectives. So the concept is simple, execution is not. In this classic green bank approach, we have different sources of capital: low cost public capital, market rate capital, low cost philanthropic capital. Those are the sort of broad flavors. The idea being to blend those, and I think they can play different amounts depending on where you are in market development. Right up front, you would need probably much more for risk tolerant public capital. As the model is proven, you can change that balance over time, which is the whole point. And those would be blended into the Forest Climate Investment Fund to provide low-cost loans for carbon smart or carbon aligned silviculture connected to increased yield of products. You'd have to design the fund around the specific criteria and structures and landowner needs, et cetera. That's why at NAP we're super excited to have the USDA Climate Smart Commodities funding, because we will be working directly with landowners to determine what practices, what do they cost, how to cast those into agreements, and how that connects to modeling to predict the outcomes and the harvest. So we're going to be able to offer that information into the conversation and into this work. I have 2 minutes, which is great. And then obviously loan repayment, which comes from when the landowners get to harvest that higher value wood. And the outcomes are, greenhouse gas drawdown and the fruit timber economy, and additional forest carbon. And I'm going to close by passing it to Lucan, not right immediately, but with advice from Peter Stein. I am aware that the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, and I don't know if this is what you're going to talk about, I apologize, but.
Is this you? All right.
No, okay, then I misunderstood.
Yeah, I think I'm.
Peter can maybe talk about this while we're in discussion. But there's a model here to play on with the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, which is similar in structure and concept in some way, so I apologize, I misunderstood. But I just wanted to put this up here for future reference, and I am not an expert in this space, but I think it has real potential because I believe everything he does. So that's it.
Thank you, Mandy. We have 5 minutes for follow-up questions, kind of anything that you want to know about this.
So,
Could you say your name?
yeah, JP Gibbons, I work with Cambridge Associates, an investment advisor. I lead their nature-based solutions research. And my first thought in a concept like this is, well, why is that not the current state? You mentioned all of these ways of generating more capital for these understocked timber private lands. Why are they not doing that right now? Is agriculture or some other revenue stream dominating the land, which would need to be replaced by replaced in terms of the revenue that they're getting from the land right now?
So it's a wonderful question. Thank you. So in my humble opinion, the reason it hasn't happened as yet is the commercial landowners have historically owned these lands for one commodity, timber production. And they have been managed over several generations to the least common denominator. Take the best, leave the rest. The lands are depleted. However, now there are two commodities on those lands, timber and carbon. So there's a new economic model for landowners to be able to take advantage of. And that has opened the door. We've spent 3 years working them through a process, forest carbon for commercial landowners, where we have sat down with commercial landowners and said, what practices would you be willing to implement? What would they cost? What's the economic modeling, and are you willing? And that is what resulted in their engagement in the Climate Smart Commodities program, where they wrote letters of support. So I think the short answer is there's a new commodity to manage for. There's a new source of income off of those lands. So there's brand new economic motivation for them to invest.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up question, Margaret Bowman with myself. Are the landowners responding? And are they interested in that additional commodity? Are they like, that's too weird and woo-woo?
The commercial landowners are very interested. So we spent 3 years in this formal process. Therefore, we got like, I'm gonna make it up, maybe a dozen letters from all of the commercial landowners in the region to the USDA and to the delegation saying, yes, please. Why not? We're offering to give them incentive money to pay them the costs of doing practices that will ultimately generate more money for them. If they can find an affordable way to do these practices, they have said yes. Sign us up because we know there's money off the far end in terms of timber values and carbon values. So they're hugely interested.
I'm Richard May from Duke University. So when it comes to forest carbon, how do you address additionality? Because we need a benchmark, business as usual, to account for. So any comments?
Yeah, so I'm going to expand your question and address additionality and leakage, two critical issues. So additionality depends upon clear baseline data, right? So we know where we're starting from, and therefore we can credibly and legitimately claim additionality. So in the USDA project, it's only 5 years. You can't generate these carbon outcomes in 5 years. So we will not be delivering much in the way of carbon gains in 5 years. What we will do is establish clear and verifiable baselines. So that is there as a basis for calculating carbon gains over time, should it go to sale of credits, et cetera. The parallel issue, the related issue is leakage, right? If we increase stocking in the northern tier, how are we going to address leakage? What is going to be harvested against what is not? And actually, the increase in stocking there comes from pre-commercial thinning. It's not really going to trigger much in the way of leakage. Leakage is more of an issue on all of those more heavily stocked southern lands, right? So actually, that's not anyway. Wherever we are reducing harvest in interest of climate gains in forest, we have to look at that model carefully and be legitimate about how we're tracking the potential for leakage. The biggest way we are addressing leakage is our model is to do climate smart forestry in a way that is all about being tied to continued harvest. So if we were saying we were going to lock these lands up and not harvest, then we would be simply transferring the carbon burden elsewhere, which we're not doing.
Hudson Edward, Conservation Collective, a UK-based entity, which is basically set up similar funds in countries such as Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Pakistan to essentially try and incentivize landowners to take up nature-based solutions. And one of the instruments that we've been using is essentially try and provide cash flow financing to farmers or landowners to cash flows from timber and non-timber forestry projects as well as carbon offsets. But an issue that we've been facing so far is primarily we are trying to sort of provide those finances to sort of project cash flows, particularly for carbon offsets. Because in those countries, I think the carbon is primarily a commodity as well. So I was wondering, I mean, how is that, the proposed fund that you're proposing, how is that sort of predicting flows in terms of carbon as well, apart from the timber, produce that's coming in?
Yeah, so thank you for that question as well. Building out the financial model, which we have not done at all yet, to understand what the cash flows are, both from timber and carbon, and the timeline upon which they happen is the underpinning right there. And I have gone to the COP for many years through my work with CGC, but I went to Egypt I was brand new with math, to listen to what was happening in the forest climate finance space. And there were a lot of sessions that had titles that related to the question you just asked. But in fact, nobody is doing this yet. It's all agricultural based with an annual cash flow return based on crops. So it's like cocoa trees was considered forest, but it had an annual agriculturally based income stream. So I think that's a new area of work to model out the cash flow projections for a forest-based system. Absolutely.
That needs to be our last question for the time being, but we have time at the end, after all those panelists have spoken. So we're going to move on, and I think Matthew is speaking next. So Matthew Carney from Quantified Ventures.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matthew Carney from QV. I know I've met some of you, but not all of you. So glad you guys are all here. It's wonderful to meet you. Oh, they're all the same. All put together. Starting off great. All right, so there were a couple of things that I was going to just walk through with the 15 minutes that I've got. So first, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking through some of the challenges and opportunities around green banks and nature-based solutions as we see them, and as we're putting together this guidebook and what we're trying to keep in mind, and then do a couple of case studies. And again, maybe similar to what Andy was saying, these are case studies that are sort of demonstrating, here's how you could sub in a green bank, perhaps, to do the type of thing for this nature-based solution that we're talking about, as opposed to here's an example of how we've done it with the green bank before, because those case studies are unfortunately few and far between at the moment. All right. So again, slightly repeating a little bit of what Andy was saying, but thinking about why are we talking about this intersection of nature-based solutions and green banks to begin with? And in my mind, it's really two things. One is the scale. So the Paris Accords basically estimated that nature-based solutions can provide nearly 40% of the mitigation needed to meet their goals by 2030, right? That's a huge chunk of the pie. And, like we've talked about, there's a lot of emphasis on renewable energy, on wind and solar, on all of these sort of new technologies, which are great and obviously vital and important, but this is also important and also has a huge role to play in meeting those targets. And we don't want to see that discounted for whatever reason. And the second piece is the capital stack. I think for these types of projects, they are a little more complicated. There are a variety of benefits, a variety of revenue streams. It requires a little more of a unique approach in order to create these projects and to make them work. It's not, you're not just going to Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and getting a commercial loan and bing, bang, boom, you're off to the races. You're needing to stack multiple benefits, multiple sources of funding. And that's, talking about the market fit, like that's really where green banks are supposed to play. They're supposed to be able to come in and play the role of a private lender and help, leverage public funds and do all of these things that are critical to the types of projects that we're talking about. So, even just like looking at this, trying to like visualize it a little bit, right? Where if you're trying to meet these costs, if you're just looking at, or if you're not counting sort of all of the additional benefits and figuring out ways to monetize each layer of that and stack them together, you're not really going to be able to reach a point of viability in order to actually pay for it and make the project go. And similarly, if you're thinking about the capital stack, then you've got the private, either equity, debt, et cetera. You need to pair that with these other elements as well in order to make it go. So thinking about a little bit about challenges and opportunities, and apologies if you can't read these in the back, hopefully the text is big enough. But just a couple of things that I wanted to highlight. And again, this is, sort of just coming from my brain onto the page. But the first thing, each of these basically got a little bit of a challenge on the left, opportunity on the right. So the first thing, and this is one of those pieces we've been talking about, is a lot of these nascent and smaller green banks are really focused on residential solar and energy efficiency. I think everyone in this room has probably heard some version of the like, oh, that's cool, that's interesting. These are the programs we have. We're not really expanding out of that as of yet. And a big part of what our job in terms of putting this guidebook together try to crack that a little bit. But what I think gives me a lot of hope, and I think is sort of a target to be driving at, is the fact that a lot of the most mature green banks that are the best capitalized, that have been around the longest, the Connecticut Green Bank, Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, et cetera, they all have these programs. Maybe it took them 10 years, but all of these green banks have seen the benefits and the value of having programs around forestry, land conservation, agriculture, water, et cetera. And so, clearly with time and money, they've seen the value of these programs. And so our hope is that we can, with this huge influx of capital coming in, basically to me, the pitch to the new green banks is like, you don't need to wait 10 years to start having these programs. You know where these other ones have ended up. You can kind of follow that path and sort of leapfrog it a little bit and get there sooner and be willing to, to go and have these models and base it off of. The second piece is just the geographic location of green banks. So as we know, right, to date, most green banks that are stood up at like the state or local level, you need the state or the local municipality or what have you to be the ones willing to capitalize it. In practice, what this has meant is that most green banks are clustered in Democratic, more liberal East Coast New England states that sort of see the value or benefit of doing that. And now that, I think we're seeing with Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, you're going to start seeing a lot more states creating new green banks, capitalizing them. That also means that the geographies of those states are going to change, and the interests are going to change. If we're starting to have green banks in, out west in Colorado, in New Mexico, and Arizona, water is a huge issue out there, obviously, much more so than it might be. Obviously, water is a huge issue everywhere, but relatively speaking to, a state like Connecticut or wherever, they might be more willing to say, hey, we actually, this is a higher priority for us than it might be for some of these other states. So I think that's just like a really important point for us to be keeping in mind as well, is just like as the geographics change and new green banks come, are sort of being born and capitalized, that's just a really important thing to be keeping a pulse on. The third piece here is that nature-based solutions so far have sort of fewer established revenue mechanisms. I think, again, one of the challenges we've heard in talking to some existing green banks is that, just from the revenue piece, you put solar panels on the roof, you're saving money on your utility bills. It's a very easy mechanism to sort of measure, have the dollars coming in, et cetera. Whereas, with the forestry piece or with water, with some of these others, it's a little more, it just takes a little more effort to construct those revenue mechanisms. But at the same time, I think one of the benefits, we sort of flip that. One of the benefits of nature-based solutions is that they have all of these other benefits outside of, the emissions reductions. And so it actually makes it easier in some ways to stack other pieces. So if you're getting, federal or state funding, because you're reducing, phosphorus levels, or because you're helping an underserved community or what have you, you can actually, even aside from those revenue mechanisms, there are other ways to sort of build the stack of money to help make these projects viable that are unique to nature-based solutions. Sort of tied to that, again, one of the things I think we've heard is this concern about nature-based solutions' ability to actually quantify the impacts of those solutions. Obviously, just using the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund as an example, they're very focused on the emissions reduction. Any project that's being funded with that money needs to be able to show what the reductions that are associated with those projects are. And that, again, is easier to do with a solar panel than it is to do with preserving forest land or, doing climate smart agriculture practices on a farm. But that being said, it's not impossible. And I think, again, part of sort of our goal and mission and sort of the work we're doing is thinking through what are the examples of that being done successfully that can be replicated and demonstrated and really used for an argument about why this can be done. It actually has that validity to sort of stand up to the scrutiny that federal requirements have. Then the last piece is there's this political desire to get the money deployed immediately. It's no secret that the target date for all the greenhouse gas reduction fund money is the summer of next year, which, surprise, surprise, is a couple of months before a big presidential election. There was a lot of political pressure to get this money spent quickly, start seeing benefits as soon as possible. If not only for the political, the obvious political piece, but also, every second counts, as we all know, we're sort of in a crisis. And so again, just as far as the opportunity goes, I think what that really puts us to is being ready with a pipeline of potential projects. So not to say, oh, well, in a couple of years, we'll have something that we can do. We need to sort of show as soon as possible what we can, what the types of projects are, and that there is a place for this money to go and start seeing these benefits as soon as we can. All right, I've got 5 minutes left, so I'll try and go through these 2 case studies. Oh, well, before the case study, so just a couple of quick examples. You can see like we've got this in agriculture, land conservation, water, climate adaptation. They all have different financing tools and structures. There's a lot of different variability that we can play with. But due to timing, I will move quickly to the next one. So the first case study I want to talk about is Connecticut Green Bank. So Lee probably knows this even better than I do. But for those of you who don't know, in the beginning of 2021, the Connecticut Green Bank basically had their charter revised by the state legislature, say, in addition to residential solar, to energy efficiency and housing, et cetera, we want the Connecticut Green Bank to also be making investments in these other areas, including agriculture, parks and recreation, climate adaptation, land conservation, waste and recycling, water, environmental markets, et cetera. So a much broader scope of what the Green Bank is going to be enabled to do. And so what QV did with Connecticut was basically the Green Bank reached out and was like, hey, we're really excited about this new charter. The only downside is everyone in this building for years has only done the programs that we have. We've only done solar, we've only done energy efficiency. We actually don't really know what investments in agriculture really looks like. So can you maybe help us do that? And so we spent a lot of time basically working with the Green Bank, essentially leading education sessions on what these financing tools could look like, programs could look like. We worked with other stakeholders around the state and sort of brought together these convenings to see how the Green Bank could work with organizations like the Department of Environmental Protection, water quality, et cetera. We helped, so they created as part of this whole process, created a new position of which Lee now is, which is fantastic. So, I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, and when we talk about this as a case study, it's not so much to be like, oh, we have this project with the Connecticut Green Bank that got financed and has been done. We know that that's the future that's coming. But for now, I think we want to highlight it because it demonstrates how a green bank that has, the first green bank in the entire country has seen that these things are important and that they want that there is a role for the green bank to have in financing them. And that's the direction they're moving in. And we want that to sort of be the example that other green banks are going to follow as well. So then the second case study that I want to talk to quickly is sort of the inverse of that. There is no green bank involved, but we think it's a really great example of the type of project a green bank could, of a nature-based solution project that a green bank could help finance in the future. So this is the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. It is a fund that was established by Quantified Ventures in partnership with the Iowa Soybean Association. It launched in Iowa. It is now in many, many states around the Midwest. in the northeast. But basically, the way that this works is the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund is essentially just a debt vehicle. So we'll go out, we get a bunch of money from investors, we take that money, we go to farmers and we say, hey, we are going to just pay you to do these climate smart ag practices on your land. And then we're going to measure two types of outcomes. We're going to do emissions reductions and we're going to do water quality. We sell the emissions reductions are bought by all these big ag companies who have their corporate goals that they're trying to meet in terms of meeting their in terms of reducing their footprint. So they'll say, all of these outcomes are being measured, quantified, et cetera. And so, for example, we'll sell them to Cargill, and Cargill are trying to reduce X% of their footprint. Purchasing these outcomes helps them meet those goals. Then you have municipalities and their relevant water districts who buy the water improvement benefits. So basically, with these, I have 100 or almost 2 million pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus being removed. That saves these water utilities a ton of money in terms of what they need to do. So they're willing to pay for these outcomes instead of doing that. It saves them money in the long run. So basically, we verify these outcomes, and then we use that money, we sell those outcomes, and then use those payments to pay back the investors. And so it kind of creates this virtuous cycle. And we have seen this grow tremendously in the past 5 years. And again, this is the type of thing where those investors could very well be a green bank, some other type of nonprofit lender. So I will stop there with us.
Thanks, we have, 5 minutes for follow-up questions from us.
Why do we need to have a green bank in every state? Like, the feel duplicative, and is that a necessary thing? Could you just expand upon the existing green banks to have a broader geography? Or
so I'm gonna speak to this row. I stole this from Coalition for Green Capital, and might be 50 years old. So I think the main reason, would you mind just introducing yourself?
Oh, right. Morgan Snyder with the Walton Family Foundation.
Awesome. So I think in my mind, it can be duplicative unless it's replaced by something else. So for example, you could have a regional green bank, in which case, okay, well now every state doesn't necessarily need one. But so far the way it's been done is they are being capitalized, they're relatively loose structures, but today they're the largest they've been so far is you're being capitalized at the state level. And so if every state doesn't have one, that means that any state that doesn't, there is no other green bank that they can get it from. The national green, if we're establishing a national green bank coalition for green capital, which is ostensibly what's going to happen with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, they are not necessarily going to be making direct investments in projects. They're going to be a hub. And so they will be giving money to Connecticut, to California, to New York, wherever. And so if a state doesn't have their own green bank, they're going to miss out on that entirely. And I think that's one of the reasons why this moment is really important in terms of getting states to have their green banks chartered, make sure there's capacity, start standing up programs, et cetera, because you not only want to have a green bank in name, you kind of want to have them in practice. And something that we've seen is a lot of states, so for example, Nevada, they established a green bank by 2017, 2018, but they didn't give them any money. So the person who runs the green bank has a different full-time job. They kind of just exist in practice. And now the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money is coming out, they're like, oh, we actually need to make this a little more serious so we can apply for money and actually do all of these things. And so I think the next 6 to 12 months is really, really critical for any state green bank to make sure that they're in the position where they've got, they're building up capacity, they're starting to structure what they want their programs to look like, doing all of the groundwork, so that way once the money spigots get turned on, they can credibly raise their hand and say, here are I've got $100 million worth of projects that we can do if you give us money, and then get it. Because otherwise it's just going to go somewhere else.
And I think we just need to squeeze in one more question and keep going. So Whoever's hand you saw first.
I feel like I have to let Lydia.
Sorry, just a very short clarifying question.
Yes.
Couldn't they also be other types of financial institutions like CDFIs? and other
Yes.
things? So like if they don't have a green bank, maybe they have a different kind of financial mechanism?
Yes, the only caveat I would add to that is that's true, but they're also gonna, like, for example, CDFIs are typically more focused on housing, right? And so if you're trying to do nature, just depending on what you want to do, there might be some distinctions, but yes, there was.
I know this is one extra, can I add one more thing? Just, we're North Carolina Clean Energy Fund. We are that green square or the green triangle up there. So we are a green bank for North Carolina. We're a nonprofit green bank. And one of the things I wanted to address your question, one of the reasons in the past, I think that states have been specific to us, or green banks have been specific to a state, is that they're legislatively mandated, like Connecticut. The newer ones, Colorado, Nevada, are coming in as nonprofits. So we're not really tied to the state. We love state funding, but we don't always get it in North Carolina. But what we're trying to do is be really flexible. So I'm going to echo a lot of what Matthew just said. I mean, we're going into this with, we know there are low-income weatherization projects. We know there are solar projects that need to be done. But this is excellent to educate the nascent green banks, the new ones that are going to be having all this capital and the flexibility to deploy the capital in a way that makes a lot of sense. Love to get you guys in front of the larger audience. I'm so excited you're developing this guidebook. Sorry. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, Matthew. I'm sorry, we got to turn it over to Lucy next.
We move backwards here.
Oh, yeah.
Hey everyone, I'm Luke Jacob. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the DC Department of Energy and Environment. And today I'm going to get kind of a crash course in our stormwater retention credit trading program. And then talk about how we're working with DC's Green Bank to finance some green infrastructure projects here in DC. So just first, I want to talk a little bit about stormwater. So stormwater management is a pretty big issue in DC. I would say, in contrast to Arizona, we have a little too much of it. The main reason is because we have a lot of impervious area. So that's like traditional roofs, streets, sidewalks, that kind of thing. And in DC, 43% of it doesn't let water pass through, and that creates a lot of runoff. So that can create flooding. We have a lot of interior flooding in DC. We also have a lot of trash going into our rivers. We've got oil and grease going into our streams, and a lot of erosion and also sediment that gets washed down and is a pollutant in itself. So here we have two sewer systems that we use to manage stormwater. The first one is the combined sewer system. So that manages the downtown central core. I think we're actually in the combined sewer system right now. And basically the way this works is you have stormwater runoff and sanitary sewage that are conveyed in one pipe network, and that goes to our wastewater treatment plant. And one of the challenges is when it rains a lot, we have combined sewer overflows. So we have a 1.2 inch rainstorm. We can have 525 million gallons of runoff. And each year that can lead to billions of gallons of combined sewer overflow. So recently there was going to be a swimming day in the Anacostia River, which was really exciting, but they had to cancel it because of a combined sewer overflow. So it's a big problem. Luckily, there is a solution in the works, and that is through our water utility, which I believe QB has worked with. So that's DC Water, and they're building these really giant underground storage tunnels like this, which are going to basically temporarily store the excess stormwater and sanitary sewage until there's capacity in the system to manage it. So the second system we have is the MS4, the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. This serves the outer 2/3 of the city, which was developed a little bit more recently. And basically the way this works is we have stormwater in its own pipe network, but it gets discharged directly into our rivers and streams. So there's no combined sewer overflow problem, but we do have all of the kind of pollutants related to runoff that I mentioned in the last slide. So really green infrastructure is our best way to manage stormwater in these outer green areas, which is why DOE, where I work, is really focused on that. We do have a challenge with that, which is it's super, super expensive. It's something close to $7 billion for a full green infrastructure build out, which we would need. And we have only $10 million each year locally to spend. So pretty dramatic difference. And the way we are getting to that goal is by leveraging our stormwater management regulations, which basically get more green infrastructure built on new development. So in DC, if you are building let's say a condo, you need to manage your stormwater. Basically, any project above the size of a single family house needs to manage its runoff. And that is by building green infrastructure either on site where your project is happening or offsite. So this offsite compliance is not really like a get out of jail free card. It's kind of built into our approach as DOE to get more green infrastructure built where we want it. So most development is happening here in the combined sewer system. We want green infrastructure built in the MS4. So it's kind of a perfect match to incentivize green infrastructure where it has its greatest benefit. So the way you meet your offsite retention requirement is by buying credits. So these are called stormwater retention credits, SRTs, and that's equivalent to a gallon of retention capacity for 1 year. So it's an annual requirement, which means you need to meet it every year and you can meet it for multiple years at a time. I'm going to go through a quick rundown on how a typical credit transaction works. So let's say we have a developer who has a 10,000 gallon requirement. They build some green infrastructure on site, which leaves a remainder that they need to address. That's 3,000 gallons in this case, and they'll do that by buying credits. So this is the demand side of the market. Sorry. Next, thinking about supply, we have SRC aggregators, which are businesses that build voluntary green infrastructure in the MS4 for the sole purpose of selling those credits. Often they partner with a landowner that wants green infrastructure. Maybe they have a localized flooding issue, and they are able to generate 3 years of credits at a time and then sell them on the market. So this is where the supply comes from. And then basically the market is something that DOE facilitates, but we kind of stay out of. So the negotiation is really between the buyer and the seller. So that's how a transaction works in a nutshell. Next, I'm going to kind of breeze through this program, which is kind of at the heart of the DC Green Bank's work in green infrastructure here. So the price lock program started by DOE, and the idea was to jumpstart the supply side of the market. So if you're thinking, hey, we're starting a new market, who wants to build voluntary green infrastructure? The answer was kind of no one, because they didn't think there would be a buyer. So what DOE does is we offer guaranteed purchase agreements for 12 years, which is kind of like we're like the buyer of last resort. So if you can't sell your credits in the market, we will buy them. And if you can sell them on the market, we will subsidize the sale to help ensure that there's kind of a long-term affordable supply of these high impact credits. So aggregators, these are the credit producers. They're at the heart of the price lock program. They need funds to build green infrastructure. Once they get it, they partner with the landowner, build GI to generate credits, and then they can sell either to a developer, plus a subsidy, or as a last resort, they'll sell to us, the DOE. And that's really how it works. The key thing here is we want this to be a repeatable model. Price lock is not going to last forever. We have $11 million set aside, and about half of it has either been spent or is locked up in contracts. So while we want to make sure that this can kind of keep happening, we're also thinking about like what is the next step after price lock is sunsetted. So I want to focus on funding sources because that is really going to be the key to this thing self-sustaining. So not surprisingly, there are some challenges which I think have been brought up in the previous two presentations. So we know a fair amount about them. Specifically in DC, one of the challenges has been traditional loans. So there are some aggregators that have been able to get loans, although it's few and far between. And the main reason, I remember Peter asked me this, you have price lock, why do you even need a green bank? And the answer is because the high interest rates basically make a project infeasible. That is the main reason aggregators with a price lock agreement aren't going to Wells Fargo, for example. The other challenge is timing. So typically an aggregator, if everything is going well, they'll need about 3 or 4 years to pay back the loan, which doesn't work for a traditional lender. This is really where the Green Bank comes in, and they've been a great partner for green infrastructure and for us in DC. And the first reason is because funding and financing for green infrastructure is one of its 4 mission areas, one of its sector focuses, which is great for us. The Green Bank also is mission driven and uses public dollars. And since it is located in DC, they also have a pretty good understanding of our market, which is only in the district right now. And lastly, this is kind of getting back to the first 2 challenges. The Green Bank is willing to offer more favorable terms than an aggregator can typically get from a traditional lender. Okay, so now I'm going to go into a few models for Green Bank financing in DC. One of them is current. So this is the first one I'm going to talk about. Next, we are working on setting up a revolving loan fund. And then lastly, this is sort of a more long-term goal, but where our hope is to set up an incubator program as the market becomes more self-sustaining. So the first one, this is, like I said, the current model. These are individual agreements between the DC Green Bank and aggregators. So there have been 2 of them so far, which is exciting, but it is still small. And the way this works is there is an agreement between an aggregator and the Green Bank. The aggregator will deliver a set number of projects over a certain number of years. And as projects come online, they repay their loan, they can get more funds for another project. This is, I don't think there's a whole lot more to say. This is a fairly simple and effective approach, but it's not really at scale and it's not available to everyone, even if they're from the price lock program. So that's why we're trying to set up a revolving loan fund, which will provide reliable and accessible capital to any aggregator that is in the price lock program, and then hopefully to any aggregator that has a long-term purchase agreement with the buyer. So the way this is going to work is we've got a green infrastructure project enrolled in price lock. They'll automatically be able to get their funds, which will let them start construction. They build their GI. They're able to certify their credits and sell them on the market to get revenue, which will then pay back their loan. And this is going to be a revolver. So the idea is that this is just going to keep recirculating. So project 2, kind of the same thing. But our goal here is for aggregators to be able to offset the steps of this so that they can start paying back loans with credits from a previous project and then use their current loan to pay for a future project. And the more that they can offset this, the closer they'll be to self-sustaining and getting loans from a traditional bank or not even really more. So that's still a ways off, but this is our vision for how this could go. The next program I want to talk about is further away, and this is something that we've been in conversation with the local DC's small business development agency, as well as the Green Bank. And the idea here is going to be to set up an incubator that's going to enable small and locally owned or small local minority-owned businesses who want to become aggregators but haven't been able to kind of break in and give them the chance to do that. And the way this is going to work, there are a few ideas swirling around. One is to have some kind of mentorship program. So one successful aggregator that's an international nonprofit interested in this work may serve as a mentor to kind of these nascent aggregators to help show them the ropes and help them build capacity. The other idea that's a little bit more set is the idea that DOE would just fund the first couple of projects for this aggregator because experience is so important. And what that'll do is enable them to get loans from the Green Bank and then hopefully eventually become self-sufficient themselves. And this really aligns with our goals of DOE in terms of water quality protection and also building a local green economy. And it also aligns really nicely with the Green Bank's goals too. This is kind of a last summary slide. I know there's a lot on it, but I think it kind of nicely boils down some of the key inputs that we're thinking about and the Green Bank's thinking about. So the first row is kind of, it's like where we're at and where we're at the cusp of with this revolving loan fund, where we have most of, or a lot of the risk being taken out through DOE's involvement and the price lock program. And next, these bottom two rows are sort of where we're headed. So as price lock winds down, and hopefully we're going to see more of these long-term offtake agreements between buyers and sellers. And particularly, I think we're going to see the bottom one because we're expecting the price to increase in credits as a new regulatory update comes into effect. So yeah, I think that's kind of it in a nutshell. This is where we're at and a glimpse of where we're trying to go.
So I fully understand that stormwater management is the major motivation here, but we are trying to nudge the Environmental Protection Agency Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So is any beginnings of measurement or quantification of co-benefits, like you might actually do tree planting as part of a rain garden? Would you begin to measure the tons of CO2 that those trees, well, in the case of that, maybe pounds of, but anyway, you know where I'm going.
Yeah, so I think, so to my knowledge, I don't know of anyone doing this yet. If they are, it would definitely be a pilot so far. And I do think one of the benefits of green infrastructure is that it's small and kind of repeatable, and you can fit it into spaces in an urban environment. And I think that is potentially a limitation around carbon crediting and accounting. And in order to make that really work, you have to aggregate multiple projects together. And I just don't know if anyone's doing that yet. Yeah.
Greg Nita with Rain Plan on the loan. We the $1.7 million loan for green infrastructure with the SRC program and a $300,000 revolver for River Smart Rewards residential installs, direct buyers at the residents. We're incorporating biochar into our installs as an example, of ways to incorporate local gasifier char into installations in the media to start generating that kind of like pilot of if you did it at scale.
We're another aggregator with Brain Plan, and we are doing this. We do a lot of tree plantings for carbon sequestration. We do biochar too, so the soil's sequestering carbon. But right now we're being locked out of any type of carbon credit recognition for the work that we're doing because no one's focusing on small footprint projects, just like you said. But the problem about this is really coming down to finance and looking at project management, that they want these large hectare projects that they get scale at tons of carbon credit. Cities need urban carbon credit solutions because we're the source of the emissions. So we really need verifiers or carbon credit companies that are work with smaller footprint projects so that we can quantify the value of this to add to the capital stack. Because right now, this whole conversation has been that there's multiple co-benefits of green infrastructure, but right now none of them are being quantified, which is really affecting our collateral value, our ability to lend and to be a borrower with financial institutions. And until we can get down that financiers are looking at the value of the co-benefits and not just financial revenue, green infrastructure investments will be limited significantly.
The question about, you said you have like 10 million a year and like total is $7 billion of cost. Like, what is this model generating? And how soon are you gonna get to that 7 billion?
Oh,
I did it. It's 430 years.
We're on track here.
yeah, so like how close to the 7 billion?
Yeah, like what, it's hard when it's like all these credits, you don't know, like what's the scale of this? It sounds great, but I just can't compare it to the total.
Yeah, so in terms of the total goal, I'm actually not sure how close we are. I think, so right now, our stormwater management regs are 10 times more green infrastructure is getting built through regulations, which the credit trading program is a part of, than through our spending. So I don't know, that doesn't quite answer your question, but I think this is our strategy to get there.
Yep.
And I think we have been hitting our goals each year. I'm not sure exactly how far along we are to the 7 billion, but I imagine not as close as we want to be.
But maybe not 432
Yeah,
years.
hopefully not.
Again, I think of these great case studies with an investor hat on. And in this one, whether it be the $7 billion deficit and the price lock floor, my immediate thought is, well, what are the returns right now as to why more money isn't flowing into this? Is it that there isn't enough demand for these credits from those that are developing to increase the price to something that is interesting enough to get more investment in there? Or is there some other kind of restriction that's necessitating a price floor and still not getting enough capital flowing that a traditional bank would be like, that's a great deal, I'm gonna finance it no matter what?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I see the rain plan.
Response to that.
Yeah.
Traditional lenders don't do new things. And when you tell people you're making revenue by planting trees, they look at you crazy. So it's new market, there's new risk, but also there's no guarantee on these future revenue streams. We're still very much in a risk. If the EPA rolls back the Clean Water Act, what happens? You know, there's so much risk involved in this. And because again, these are considered small footprint projects, the world of finance doesn't look at things like you're not having anything less than 150 million from institutional banking. This is falling so far below where the world of finance meets the world of nature-based solutions. That's why the gap is there.
And what has been developed thus far, have the returns been profitable? And if profitable, how profitable?
Yeah, very profitable. Actually, I was going to say that, I mean, Nicole's 100% right that, you know, the more complicated and brain damage and structuring a transaction, you know, money's a commodity and it goes through these paths of resistance, if that makes sense. But this model particularly is only an offset to current development demand. So when interest rates go up, cranes go down, there's not as much offset. So that kind of goes into that's your constraint. It's less about supply, it's more about demand. And once there is demand, what happens is you're seeing as the fluctuations in development, typical commercial development, you're going to see the price credit drop down, which they're being a market maker by keeping a stabilized, you know, level. But really, you need more development demand to drive the demand, you know, or aspect. But overall, the Green Bank has done a phenomenal job of bringing mission-focused capital to plug that. And the more you can do that, but I say I think the aspect to the big thing that Luca's talking about is more sophisticated buyers who aren't buying just because it's free or they get a credit, and that's where I say the revolver that we're doing with residents. We have residents buying green infrastructure because they like green infrastructure. They want to have coffee on their deck and look out over their garage and have a green roof and et cetera. So you kind of got to drive just, you know, a demand-based marketplace. And I think that's kind of the curve that we're trying to get over, is people buying not just because there's a free, but because it's a luxury item to have green infrastructure on my property that creates appreciation, which I would say, to Nicole's point, we need to put some tangible. You can't go from revenue to rewards. Revenue needs to be replaced with revenue generation on an aspect, just the way banks, you know, and money works. That I'm curious, and I'll just throw this question out there. There hasn't been, you know, green infrastructure, nature-based solutions is a land management, land development concept. And the biggest aspect of land management, land development on landowners' balance sheets is tax. You either have cost of goods sold, tax benefit, and revenue is your balance sheet. So what we haven't seen is any cost segregation, tax benefit like you've seen drive the energy marketplace. in the capital construct to create another value for the buyer to drive up their volume for it as a, because usually people buy land to depreciation value or some sort of tax shelter.
Have there been new models or tools that are measuring benefit cost analysis by incorporating each of these solutions?
So if you look at the forestry, so throw it out there is a lot of forestry will not actually be the actual production. They'll sell their land as a ground lease and take the depreciation benefit with it. So that's why I say, as you plug into the supply chain, there is aspects of depreciation value that could help drive nature-based solutions to help make the cost of goods sold or the investment and be more, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to drive a commercial marketplace, you either increase revenues or you decrease taxes, because taxes is your biggest frictional cost.
So I'd like to help us transition to our full Q&A with all the panelists, and if the panelists are willing to come up here, so everyone should see that, that'd be great. And I don't think I ever even said my name at the beginning. I'm Phoebe Higgins, Director of Market for Environmental Policy Innovation Center. I have a few questions for the panelists, but I think we should just start with this group's questions because everybody's got good ones. So let's start there. Yeah, thank you all so much. These are really excellent presentations and conversations to be having. So with that, I guess I'll keep an eye on who raises their hand first, and we'll just go around that way. So Harry and then Peter.
Matthew, I'm thinking now we're talking about demand here for the stormwater, and so I'm thinking about your case study of Stormwater Outcomes Fund. Could you tell us a little bit more about where the demand is coming from on the water side, and how does that break down between drinking water and wastewater in particular, but like also any challenges to creating that demand maybe you see in different states?
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, just to preface, like I do not work directly on the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, so some of the details I might not know because we basically established that fund, but it's administered by, you know, it has like its own staff that works on it. So QB basically helps establish it, but it has its own team staff that do all of the work. So some of the more detailed things I might not know. But generally speaking, you know, the demand for the water credits is really coming from wastewater utilities. To the how it breaks down within that, I'm a little less sure. But you know, that's primarily who it's been. So it's like you're really talking to municipalities. But it has the demand has definitely been there, you know. So I would say, I mean, the fund has grown pretty significantly each year it's been in existence. And the financing really only works with both of those stacked together. It's not going to survive with only one or the other. And so, you know, as it's growing, that's obviously reflecting the demand for both of those aspects. It's not just like one or the other, you know, kind of carrying it.
We'll go to Peter, and you can ask a question. If any other panelists have things to add after one person answers, like you have a panelist preference, so you can jump in.
I have a question for Andy, and it has to do with baselines. And you were quite eloquent about being serious about you know, credible baselines as a key component. So if you paid a private landowner to change their practices, and then is there some extra, and my sense is that would cause over time the baseline to go up, meaning more timber volume would exist on per acre, those acres of forest. Are you expecting that those landowners might also enter into carbon markets, or are you just, for, you know, for now at least, dismissing carbon markets?
Yeah, so establish the baseline so you have a credible basis for if they want to enter carbon markets, right? In the work that we are currently doing under the USDA grant, we are not baking in the assumption that they will sell the carbon. That's not part of the model, because that was not the commodity that USDA wanted to allow. They wanted to allow other commodities. I would assume that down the line, they will be monetizing the carbon. That's like a major driver, obviously. Given all of the credits about offsets now and baselines, I don't know exactly when and how that'll happen. But we'll assume that it is on the table in a big way, so we want to establish the credible baseline, so where and if that happens, it's legitimate. And since I'm just got the floor for a sec, I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. You spurred a really interesting idea for another financial product, where to lower embodied carbon. So we could do an embodied carbon reduction credit, an ECRC, right? Boston, for example, uses 359 million cubic feet of wood a year in construction. 98% of it is imported into the state. So you could establish that kind of a market in the urban areas that would provide a market and income stream for the activities in the forestry region. Fascinating concept.
Next question, back there.
A follow-up to this carbon offset idea. Do you think from your experience that this needs to come from the federal level, state level? Can this be something that even the municipality, like Department of Energy and Environment, can create something like this? At what level is the appropriate creation? Because we're not seeing any federal leadership on this.
On what? On the
On
incentives?
creating an offset, like a carbon offset, to have a you said USDA was not
Have
interested,
a verifiable carbon offset.
that USDA was not interested in monetizing a carbon credit in that project. At what, if that's our federal, if they're not doing it, where is the appropriate entry point? Who should be the administrator of something like this? Is it the public sector? Is it the private sector, which is kind of launched, it's very murky? Who should be, from your experience, who should be an entity that is taking the lead on carbon credit generation?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding your question correctly, and there's so many threads there, I might not be, I apologize. To establish the legitimate, verifiable standard that is used broadly in the market, you know, the experience that we're having is that that's coming out of the private sector right now. It's coming out of innovation private sector. And then there's scrutiny and we're uncovering gaps and weaknesses in that. So inevitably with innovation, there will be that. It'll work at some level, it will be inaccurate, it needs to be improved. So the observation is it's happening from the non-governmental sector right now. So my guess would be that that's really what we're working with, much like with FSC and other kinds of certification. To assume that it would come from the government, I think that's just, especially our government right now is such a morass. I can't imagine getting that policy out and functional. It might eventually come through the EPA. I mean, it's clearly within, it's consistent with other kinds of baseline regulation that's out there to shape and drive different marketplaces. So it could come from the EPA, but in fact, it's coming from the private sector right now. So I don't really know. I would assume that we will have it sooner through editing and improving on what's happening in the private sector than shift the public. But your guess there is as good as mine. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, sort of. It was whether or not that the public sector can take the lead on this and at which level would be most appropriate.
Well, obviously California did, Washington just did, Oregon. So there are public sector carbon markets.
Could I add something about USDA? That they actually recently did kind of take a lead on it and then haven't really followed through. There was the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which I thought was a really elegant compromise of saying USDA is not going to certify each individual credit, but they're going to certify the certifiers. They're going to say, like, this method is not complete BS, and you're on our list as being good. That it was passed by the Senate, I think unanimously, but then it took a little while to get it through the House, and then it got watered down and passed as part of last year's appropriations bill, and we haven't really seen what USDA will do to fully implement that. But also part of the leadership at USDA's logic is, like you were saying, they're more interested in commodities that are climate smart than carbon as its own commodity. So they've got a little bit of a disconnect there, I think.
Sure, and the whole point is that by monetizing the carbon credit, you unlock the ability to finance these carbon solutions. That's a critical piece to the financing component to all of this.
Please, next. Lee Welton, currently with the Conservation Finance Network and after maternity leave with the Connecticut Green Bank. So this might be a little off script, but Matthew, we were talking a little bit before the presentation started on the notice of funding opportunity that just came out for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And if there's like a slight sliver of hope for environmental infrastructure under that NOFO. So curious just to daylight a little bit of your perspective there. And then we were talking about, well, if there isn't a kind of bright light from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for, say, water projects or something like that, is there a perspective on fungibility within a green bank? They get enough funds from the EPA that frees up some money to play with in some of these other project types and opportunities. So I just wanted to bring that forward.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is also quick preview. I know we're talking about this more tomorrow. So we can go into it in a little more depth, but the sort of TLDR short answer is there is a window in GGRF, but kind of small. So as I assume most folks know, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, it's split into 3 competitions. There's the 14 billion National Clean Investment Fund, 6 billion Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, and then the 7 billion Solar for All. So Solar for All, it's in the name, it's only solar, it's not nature-based solutions. But really that was like always kind of separate. That was like a Bernie Sanders thing. Really the 20 billion was like the National Green Bank pot that then got split into 2. So of those, the 6 billion national or the Clean Communities Investment Act is that 6 billion that is 100% only low income underserved communities, and all of the money in that has to be spent in their 3 priority areas, which are basically renewable energy, energy efficiency for residential, and clean transportation. So that sort of forecloses that amount of funding. But then the largest pot, the 14 billion, it has those same 3 priority areas, but it's technically any project that meets their criteria, even if it's not in those priorities, can still be eligible. That being said, like if you then look at the criteria, you have to sort of demonstrate that there are some of these other benefits. So again, it's a little bit of like a needle, so maybe technically feasible, but we'll just have to be thoughtful about it, and we'll talk about it more tomorrow. And then also, I'm sure she says we'll bring together the guidebook. But the other thing that Lee and I were sort of talking about is potentially some of the hope is that I think ultimately, really the question is just like, do green banks want to be doing nature-based solutions or not? And if they don't, it's going to be kind of hard. But if they do, and they're just like, oh, well, we really want to be doing this, but we just, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money that we have has these strings, and we maybe can't use it for this type of project. What we are also hoping is that there's some fungibility. So for example, Connecticut Green Bank, they get money from the state every year. So if now they're getting a bunch of Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money, but they can only spend it on these types of projects, well, they might just say, well, that's cool. We'll just, the money we get from the state, we'll use on nature-based solutions because that comes with no strings. So I think those are just some of the considerations that we'll just be wanting to keep in mind. But, at the fundamental level, I think it's just, is the Green Bank in X state or wherever interested in doing nature-based solutions or not? And that's just a case by case basis.
We have time for at least one more question. I saw the hand.
Yeah, I actually want to keep going on that because one of the things within the NCIF is Justice 40, obviously 40% of the benefits need to go to disadvantaged communities. And I think we're mission based in North Carolina. So our focus is going to be on those communities anyway. So we will probably go above and beyond the 40%. So talk to me a little bit about, because one of the arguments is we're reducing greenhouse gases in disadvantaged communities to the benefit of those communities, right? And when you're applying for the NCIF, talk to me a little bit about what those benefits could be so we can tell that story a little bit more.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, when we talk about the benefits, at least for nature-based solutions, I think you've got the obvious sort of like emissions benefits that are, obviously it's in the name, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that's like sort of what's most germane to them. But I think the ones that stick out to me is sort of, in addition to that, you have health benefits. So if you think about putting parks or trees in low-income neighborhoods that have higher average temperatures, have higher rates of asthma because the air pollution is higher. You know, you've got, so those sort of like quality of life and health benefits are really important. You know, things like water quality, you know, like anything, almost any benefit, it's disproportionate to low-income communities. So if you think about whatever benefits associated with nature-based solutions, if you're able to also target those in low-income communities, that can be really helpful. I also think that, like, you know, I think one of the things we've seen is like a lot, when people hear like, oh, like low-income, underserved communities, I think very often they tend to think, oh, urban cities, et cetera. But really, I mean, if you're talking about things like land conservation, you know, ag or forestry, a lot of these are in rural areas where incomes are depressed, that are historic. You know, a lot of the work we're doing now is in like, or that we're trying to do now is in Appalachia and coal country, where they have all of these impervious surfaces from coal and strip mining. And, you know, these are communities that are also underserved, low income, et cetera, that have these really significant environmental challenges, you know, just based on their topography and their history, and everything else. So, you know, I just, you know, in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about those communities as well, it can, I think can be relevant for the types of nature-based issues.
And I'll just use both the panel privilege and the Montpelier, Vermont privilege, right? We were just devastated by flood, devastated. And we thought we lived in a climate, you know, in a gentle climate bubble in Northern England, right? We do not. And when I think of underserved communities across our region and many regions, that susceptibility to flooding, where most towns are built on rivers, and we are all going to be suffering the consequence of a warmer atmosphere that can hold a ton more water, that it rains for 7 weeks, soil is saturated, and then flooding is inevitable. So there's a big series of connections to underserved communities that come from the overall reduction of carbon that is a very real and specific and geographically defined impact. Because the poor people in underserved communities usually live on the river, right? So in substandard housing that gets flooded out and then they know where to live. So that's just another thing that comes in.
Quantifying the benefit that's going to be difficult.
Yeah, but there's unfortunately new models, new experiences that then we can now use as data points for quantifying. We can quantify the costs that our small communities face on, and it will be representative of other small rural towns. Yeah.
This conversation has been really great. Thanks for everybody's questions. And we are going into a break where there's still plenty of time to approach the panelists with your direct questions for them and talk to each other. And you may remain in this room or in the lobby area. So we have until 11 before this room needs to be used again and reconfigured and all that. So please stick around and keep talking and continue this great conversation. Is there anything that you need to add, Lydia and Sarah, as the host for the location here?
I would just say we really appreciate you all coming and thank you for being part of this conversation. And if you'd like to stay involved and find out what's next, and you are, you know, we don't have your contact information, please feel free to give that to Sarah, Katie, or myself, and we will put you on our email list. We also are planning to send out the recording of this event, and so feel free to share it with your friends and help us get more folks involved in this process. So thank you so much. It's been great to have you here.